Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in The New Science by Giambattista Vico. We are on Chapter 3 of Book 2, entitled Poetic Wisdom, and the title of this particular chapter is The Origins of the Census and the Treasury. And we begin with paragraph 619. The plebeians continued to be oppressed by the usurious exactions and the frequent usurpations of their fields by the nobles, to such a point that at the end of the period, Marcius Philippus, tribune of the plebs, cried out in public that 2,000 nobles possessed all the fields that should be divided among a good 300,000 citizens, the number counted at Rome in his time. Beginning 40 years after the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus, in the comfortable assurance of his death, the nobility had again begun to be insolent towards the unhappy plebs. The Senate of those days had been obliged to put into practice an ordinance requiring the plebeians to pay into the public treasury the census tax, which previously they had had to pay privately to the nobles, in order that thenceforth the treasury should be able to take care of the costs of war. From this time, the census acquires new prominence in Roman history. According to Livy, the nobles disdained the administration of it as something unworthy of their dignity. But Livy failed to understand that the nobles did not want it because it was not the census ordained by Servius Tullius, which had been the basis of the liberty of the lords, and had been paid privately to them. For Livy, like all other authorities, was under the false impression that the census of Servius Tullius had been the basis of popular liberty. For certainly there was no magistracy of greater dignity than the censorship, from which the first year had been administered by the consuls. In this fashion the nobles, through their own avaricious machinations, came themselves to set up the census, which later was the basis of popular liberty. So that when the fields had all fallen into their hands in the time of Philippus the tribune, these 2,000 nobles had to pay the tribute for 300,000 other citizens, then counted, just as in Sparta all the land had come into possession of the few, because in the treasury there was a register of the census taxes, which the nobles had privately imposed on the fields, which, in an uncultivated state, they had of old allotted to the plebeians for cultivation. On account of the inequality referred to, there must have been great agitations and revolts among the Roman plebs. These were quelled by Fabius with a most prudent measure which earned him the name Maximus. He ordered that the whole Roman people should be divided into 3 classes, senators, knights, and plebeians, and that the citizens should be placed in these classes according to their means. This consoled the plebeians, for the senatorial order, which previously had consisted solely of nobles, and which held all the magistracies, could thenceforward be entered by the plebeians of wealth, and thus the regular avenue to all civil honors was open to plebeians. 620. This development gives truth to the tradition that the census of Servius Tullius was the basis of popular liberty, for in it the matter was prepared, and from it the occasions were born, as we set forth hypothetically above in the notes on the chronological table, and the passage on the Publilian law. It was this ordinance, originating in Rome itself, that established the democratic commonwealth there, and not the law of the 12 tables, supposed to have been brought there from Athens. Indeed, what Aristotle calls a democratic commonwealth is rendered in Tuscan by Bernardo Segni as a commonwealth by census, meaning a free, popular commonwealth. This is evident even in Livy, for ignorant as he was of the Roman form of government in those times, he nevertheless states that the nobles complained that by the law they had lost more in the city than they had gained abroad by force of arms in that year, though it was a year of many great victories. And for this reason Publilius, the author of the law, was called the people's dictator. 621. With popular liberty, in which the whole people constitute the city, It came about that civil ownership lost its proper meaning of public ownership, which had been called civil from the word city, and was dispersed among all the private ownerships of the Roman citizens, who together now made up the Roman city. The dominium optimum, or best ownership, lost its above stated original meaning of strongest ownership, not weakened by any real encumbrance, even public, and survived in the meaning of ownership of property, free of any private encumbrance. Hereditary ownership no longer signified such ownership of a piece of land that if the client or plebeian lost possession of it, the noble from whom he had the title to it was obliged to come to his defense. The first auctores iuris, or lawmakers in Roman law, were those whose duty it was, in connection with these clientels ordained by Romulus and no others, to expound to the plebeians these and no other laws. For indeed, what other laws could the nobles have been obliged to set forth to the plebeians, since the latter, down to the 309th year of Rome, had no privilege of citizenship, and since the laws themselves, down to a century after the law of the 12 Tables, had been kept hidden from the plebs by the nobles in their college of pontiffs. So in those days the nobles were auctores iuris, in a sense which survived in the laudatio auctoritatis, by possessors of purchased lands, when they are summoned in a suit for recovery by others, and, cited the authors, from whom they have the title, and whom they wish to assist and defend them. Hereditary ownership now meant private civil ownership capable of being defended by the action of re vindicatio, whereas bonitary ownership could be maintained by possession only. 622. In the same fashion, and not otherwise, by the eternal nature of fiefs, these things recurred in the returned barbarian times. Let us take, for example, the kingdom of France. Here the various provinces now composing the nation were sovereign signories of the prince subject to the king of that realm, and the princes must have held their property without any public encumbrance. Later, through succession, rebellion, or failure of heirs, they were incorporated into the kingdom, and all the property, ex aer optimo, of the princes became subject to public exactions. For the lands and houses of the kings, which contained their royal chambers, having passed by marriage or concession to their vassals, are now found subject to taxation and tribute. Thus, in hereditary kingdoms, ownership, ex aer optimo, was gradually confused with private ownership, subject to public charges, just as the fisc, which was the patrimony of the Roman emperor, was gradually confused with the public treasury. 623. Our research into the census and the treasury has been the most difficult of our investigations into Roman things, as we indicated in the idea of the work. Chapter 4. The Origins of the Roman Assemblies. 624. Our studies showed that the Bulli and the Agora, the two above noted heroic assemblies of which Homer speaks, must have corresponded respectively to the Roman Comitia Curiata, the assembly by Curiae, which we read as the most ancient under the kings, and the Comitia Tributa, or assembly by tribes. The former were called Curiata from quire, meaning spear, whose genitive quirus was later used as the nominative, in conformity with what we have set forth in our Origins of the Latin Language. Just as from cier, hand, which among all nations meant power, must have been derived from the Greek curia, which the same meaning as the Latin curia. Hence came the curites, who were priests armed with spears, for all the heroic peoples were composed of priests, and only the heroes had the right to bear arms. The curites, as we have seen above, were found by the Greeks in Saturnia, or ancient Italy, in Crete, and in Asia. Curia, in its ancient sense, must have meant signory, just as aristocratic commonwealths are now called signories. From the curia of these heroic senates came kairos, for authority, but this authority, as we have observed above, and shall observe more closely, was that of ownership. From these origins came the modern kyrios for sir, or kyria for madame. And as the Greek curates came from cheir, Cheir, so we saw above that the Roman quirites came from queer, Quuir. Quirites was the total of Roman majesty given to the people in public assembly, as we have also noted above in a passage in which, comparing the assemblies of the Gauls and the ancient Germans with that of the Greek curates, we observed that all the first barbarous peoples held their public assemblies under arms. 625. Thus the majestic title of quirites must have been first used at a time when the people consisted entirely of nobles, who alone have the right to arm. Later, when Rome had become a popular commonwealth, the title passed to the people, including the plebeians. For the assemblies of the plebs, who at first did not have the right to arm, were called comitia tributa, from tribus, meaning tribe. And among the Romans, just as in the state of the families, the latter were so called from the famuli, so in the later state of the cities the term tributum, meaning tribute, came from tribus, meaning tribe, because the tribes of the plebeians met to receive the orders of the reigning senate, the chief and most frequent of which were demands upon the plebeians for contributions to the treasury. 626. Subsequently, however, Fabius Maximus introduced the reformed census, which divided the whole Roman people into 3 classes according to the patrimonies of the citizens. Before this, only the senators had been knights, for in heroic times only nobles had the right to arm, and hence in Roman history we read that the ancient Roman commonwealth was divided into fathers and plebs. Thus in those days senator and patrician had been interchangeable terms, and likewise plebeian and ignoble. And as there had been thus only 2 classes of the Roman people, so there had been only 2 kinds of assembly. One, the curiata, consisting of fathers or nobles or senators; the other, the tributa, consisting of plebeians or the ignoble. But now that Fabius had divided the citizens according to their means into the 3 classes of senators, knights, and plebeians, the nobles ceased to be a separate order in the city, and were placed in one or another of the 3 classes according to their wealth. From that time on, patricians were distinguished from senators and knights, and plebeians from the base-born, and plebeians were no longer contrasted with patricians, but with knights and senators. A plebeian no longer meant a base-born person, but rather a citizen of small patrimony, who might well be a noble. And on the other hand, a senator no longer meant a patrician, but a citizen of ample patrimony, who might well be of low birth. 627. Consequently, from that time on, comitia centuriata, the assembly by hundreds, was the term applied to the assemblies in which the entire Roman people of all 3 classes came together to enact the consular laws, among other public business. Those assemblies were still called comitia tributa, in which the plebs alone enacted tribunal laws. These were the plebiscites at first, so called in the sense rendered by Cicero as plebi nota, or laws published to the plebs. An example cited by Pomponius is Junius Brutus, announcing to the plebs that the kings had been forever expelled from Rome. In monarchies, the royal laws might with equal propriety be called populo nota, quote, made known to the people, end quote. On this account, Baldus, as acute as he was lacking in erudition, expressed surprise that the word plebiscitum should have been written with 1 s, since in the sense of a law enacted by the plebs, it should have had 2, the citum being that case from scissor, not scio, and taking the genitive plebis instead of the dative plebi. 628. Lastly, for the certainty of divine ceremonies, there remained the comitia curiata, or assemblies of the heads of the curiae alone, in which sacred matters were dealt with. For in the time of the kings, all profane matters were regarded as sacred, and the heroes were everywhere curates, or armed priests, as we have said above. Hence, down to the last days of Rome, since paternal power was still viewed as sacred, and its regulations are often called sacra patria in the laws, adoptions took place in these assemblies by leges curiatae. Chapter 5. Corollary. Divine Providence is the ordainer of commonwealths, and at the same time of the natural law of nations. Paragraph 629. We have seen that the generation of commonwealths began in the age of the gods, in which governments were theocratic, that is, divine. Later they developed into the first human, that is, the heroic governments, here called human to distinguish them from the divine. Within these human governments, even as the mighty current of a kingly river retains far out to sea the momentum of its flow and the sweetness of its waters, the age of the gods continued to run its course, for that religious way of thinking must still have persisted, by which whatever men themselves did was attributed to the agency of the gods. Thus, in the state of the families, they made a Jove out of the reigning fathers, and out of the same fathers, as united in closed borders at the birth of the first cities, they made a Minerva. Out of their ambassadors sent to the aroused clients, they made Mercury. And finally, as we shall see shortly, out of the corsair heroes they made Neptune. Herein is divine providence to be supremely admired, for when men's intentions were quite otherwise, it brought them in the first place to the fear of divinity, the cult of which is the first fundamental basis of commonwealths. Their religion in turn led them to remain fixed on the first vacant lands, which they occupied before all others, and such occupation is the source of all the property rights. When the more robust giants had occupied lands on the mountain tops, where the perennial springs arise, Providence ordained that they thus should find themselves in healthful and defensible sites, and with abundance of water, so that they could safely stop there and put an end to their wanderings. And these are the three qualities that lands must have in order for cities later to arise upon them. Further, again by means of religion, Providence led them to unite with chosen women for constant and lifelong companionship, hence the institution of matrimony, the recognized source of all authority. Later, with these women, they were found to have established the families, which are the seed plot of the commonwealths. And finally, with the opening of the asylums, they discovered that they had founded the clienteles. Thus the elements were prepared from which, for the first agrarian law, the cities were to be born, based on the two communities of men that composed them, one of nobles to command, the other of plebeians to obey. The latter are called by Telemachus in a speech in Homer the quote-unquote other people, which is to say a subject people, different from the reigning people, which was made up of heroes. Hence emerges the subject matter of political science, which is nothing other than the science of commanding and obeying in states. And at their very birth, Providence causes the commonwealths to spring forth aristocratic in form, in conformity with the savage and solitary nature of the first men. This form consists entirely, as writers on political theory point out, in guarding the boundaries and the orders, so that peoples newly come into humanity might, by the very form of their governments, continue for a long time to remain enclosed within these boundaries and orders, and so forget the infamous and nefarious promiscuity of the bestial and feral state. But the minds of men were preoccupied with particulars and incapable of understanding a common good. They were accustomed never to concern themselves with the affairs of others, as Homer makes his Polyphemus tell Ulysses. And in this giant Plato recognizes the fathers of the families in the so-called state of nature preceding the civil state. Providence, therefore, by the aforesaid aristocratic form of their governments, led them to unite themselves to their fatherlands, in order to preserve such great private interest as their family monarchies were, for this is what they were entirely bent upon. And thus, beyond any design of theirs, they were brought together in a universal civil good called commonwealth. 630. Now here, by those divine proofs we spoke of as an above method, Let us consider and meditate on the simplicity and naturalness with which Providence ordered these affairs of men, of which they said truly, though in a false sense, that they were all the work of the gods. And let us consider in this connection the immense number of civil effects, which may all be traced to those four causes, which, as we have observed throughout this work, are the four elements, as it were, of the civil universe, namely religion, marriage, asylum, and the first agrarian law, which we have discussed above. Then let us ask ourselves if, among all human possibilities, so many and such various and diverse effects could in any way have had simpler or more natural beginnings among those very men who are said to be Epicurus, to have been born of chance, and by Zeno to have been creatures of necessity. Yet chance did not divert them, nor fate force them out of this natural order. For at the point when the commonwealths were to spring forth, the matter was all prepared, and ready to receive the form. And there came forth the formation of the commonwealths composed of mind and body. The prepared materials were these men's own religions, their own languages, their own lands, their own nuptials, their own names, clans or houses, their own arms, and hence their own commands, their own magistrates, and finally their own laws. And because these things were their own, they were completely free, and therefore constitutive of true commonwealths. And all this came about because all the aforesaid institutions had previously belonged to the family fathers as monarchs in the state of nature. The fathers at this juncture, by uniting themselves in an order, came to produce the civil sovereign power, just as in the state of nature they had held the family powers, subject to no one under God. This sovereign civil person was formed of mind and body. The mind was an order of wise men with such wisdom as could naturally exist in that time of extreme crudeness and simplicity. Hence, the eternal property of commonwealths, that without an order of wise men, states may present the appearance of commonwealths, but are so many dead and soulless bodies. There was also the body, formed of the head and lesser members. Hence, this second eternal property of commonwealths, that some men must employ their minds in the tasks of civil wisdom, and others their bodies in the arts and crafts that are needed in peace as well as in war. And there is a third eternal property, that the mind should always command, and the body should have perpetually to obey. 631. Yet here is an even greater cause for marveling. By bringing about the birth of the families, all of them born with some awareness of a divinity, although because of their ignorance and disorder, none knew the true one, since each family had its own religion, language, lands, nuptials, name, arms, government, and laws, Providence had at that time brought into being the natural law of the gentis maioris, with all the aforesaid properties, to be used later by the family fathers over their clients. In like fashion, in creating the commonwealths by means of the aristocratic form in which they arose, Providence caused the natural law of the gentes maioris, or families, which had been formerly observed in the state of nature, to be transformed into the natural law of the gentes minoris, or peoples, to be observed in the time of the cities. For the family fathers, to whom all the aforesaid prerogatives belonged to the exclusion of their clients, at the time when they had banded themselves together in a natural order against the latter, came to confine all the aforesaid properties within their civil orders against the plebs. In this consisted the severely aristocratic form of the heroic commonwealths. 632. In this way, the natural law of nations, which is now observed among peoples and nations, was born as a property of the sovereign civil powers at the birth of the commonwealths. So a people or nation that has not within itself a sovereign civil power, vested with all the aforesaid properties, is not properly a nation or people at all, nor can it exercise abroad in its relations with other peoples or nations the natural law of nations, but both the law and its exercise will fall to another people or nation superior to it. 633. What we have here set forth, added to what we have mentioned above of the heroes of the first cities calling themselves gods, will explain the meaning of the phrase aiora a dies posita, or laid down by the gods, applied to the dictates of the natural law of nations. But when the natural law of human nations ensued, on which we have cited Ulpian several times above, and upon which the philosophers and moral theologians based their understanding of the natural law of fully unfolded eternal reason, the phrase was fitly reinterpreted to mean that the natural law of nations was ordained by the true God. This is the end of chapters 4 and 5 from section 5 on poetic politics from book 2 of The New Science by Giambattista Vico. In the next video, we will continue in this section with chapter 6, entitled Heroic Politics. Thank you for listening.